Now I'm sweating even more. Okay, good afternoon, Cumberland. I'd like to bring this Committee of the Whole meeting to order. I'm sitting in for our Mayor Brown, who is greeting us with Zoom today from Vancouver. And I'd like to add that we are honored to gather on the unceded traditional territory of the Comox First Nation. So I'd like to move the agenda.
Move approval.
Second.
So moved. Delegations? No delegations. To reports. Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation Housing Accelerator Fund, prepared by Courtney Simpson, Manager of Development Services. And we have Nancy Henderson here from Urban Systems as well.
Thank you. So I just want to say a couple of things before turning it over to Nancy Henderson. We have an opportunity to apply to the Housing Accelerator Fund. This is a federal program through Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. It's the first time this funding opportunity has been offered. And we've been working hard in the background with consultant Nancy Henderson and her team to put together a good application. And what we're looking for today is some feedback from council on proposed 5 actions to increase housing supply that we would propose in this funding application. I have found this a very rather complicated funding program to understand, so please don't feel shy to ask questions because this has taken a lot of minds and rereading and guidance from CMHC as well to understand it fully. So with that, I'll like to turn it over to Nancy Henderson.
Let's put up the presentation here. Okay, alrighty. I'm assuming everyone can see my screen okay, and yeah, thank you for having me. We do have, just further to what Ms. Simpson was saying, we've been working quite diligently with Canadian Mortgage and Housing Association across numerous clients to essentially position the village well for this fund and understand this opportunity. I mean, it's quite an interesting funding program. It's not like a typical grant. It's incentive-based funding, so it's hard to kind of get our minds around that at times because we're so used to applying for a specific project and that the funding would be worth the value of that project. This is very different. It's based on incenting municipalities to increase the housing supply and getting funding based on the number of units and type of units that you're putting out. So I'll go over that in a little more detail. And then if council has questions, like happy to answer them either at the end or if you want to interrupt, I'm also fine with that. So in terms of the program, it's $4 billion, which sounds like a lot of money, but it is across the country, and there's 4,000 municipalities across Canada, and there's quite a few that are very interested in this program. So it is going to be a competitive program, but I think that the village is well situated for it based on the growth that you've seen over the last several years and the also potential for continued growth and just the council's strategic priorities and where you're at as a municipality. So the goal is to create 100,000 new units across the country. And these, when we say 100,000, it's net new, meaning 100,000 more than what would be done under the sort of status quo. So it's sort of over and above what we would typically see. So there's, how to get units out there faster. So speeding up the approvals and building processes, which is very aligned with what the village has been working on with the development process approvals program for the last couple of years. The program does look favorably and is aligned with sort of the Complete Communities initiative and more sort of walkable, complete communities, as well as, communities that are thinking of low carbon and climate resilience, which also fits well with Cumberland's outlook. So the program itself is based on developing five initiatives for municipalities under 10,000. There's a couple different categories, 5 initiatives for under 10,000, 7 for over 10, and then the large cities are doing 11. it is the municipality does need to commit to larger than sort of status quo housing growth target for the 3-year period of the fund. So really it's about getting development that the village already foresees happening, but getting that out faster than you would typically see to try to create more supply, thinking that that will catch up with the demand and potentially flatten out the housing market a bit. There is a requirement to complete and update a housing needs assessment, which is already underway in the village to support your OCP. And then there's reporting and monitoring that needs to take place during the term of the funding on an annual basis. So the 5 initiatives are really key, and we have spent a lot of time with CMHC getting advice on the best types of initiatives, balancing off supply type initiatives with systemic change. CMHC really wants to see that municipalities are going to put systemic change in place that's going to make increasing the housing supply over time easier, so that the municipalities can potentially reflect or adjust to changes in market demand more easily. So they do want to see some long lasting. There's a couple when you're filling out the grant forms, there's sort of what will be done in the 3 years of half, but they're also looking at another column in terms of what will be the impact over a 10-year period. So the more of the land base that's impacted by the changes, the better. So it's not just a 3-year short-term thinking type thing. So they also want to look at like the DAPR, the Development Application Process Improvement Program. They want to see more development predictability and stability versus like see more pre-zoning type things and things that are going to make people want to invest in the community versus kind of going in and negotiating application on a one-off basis. Those are the types of things they're also looking at. And as noted, the more of the land base that's impacted, the better. But that doesn't necessarily mean you need to zone areas of the land of the village that you didn't intend on zoning. But what it might mean is if you were looking at increasing suites, for example, that you're doing it off many properties, not just one neighborhood, that type of thing. So in terms of how you can utilize these funds is you can utilize them to pay for your 5 action plan initiatives. The action plan initiatives are likely sort of a fraction of the overall incentive funding. So there's going to be money left over. And that can be utilized on community-related infrastructure to support affordable housing. So if you need, upgrades to improve fire flows because of increased density, you could spend it on those infrastructure improvements. You could spend it on supporting affordable housing, buying land, for example, for affordable housing, or incenting housing. You can also spend it on community amenities that are needed to support residential growth, and from fire halls to fire trucks to recreation facilities to parks and so on, are all eligible uses of the funds. And I think just before I move on, in terms of the expenditures of the funds, like what's really expected at time of application is more just an understanding of the percentages in which the municipality sees spending those funds. It doesn't have to be outlined in specific projects. The CMHC is more interested, and there's a lot more detail required on the 5 initiatives. So when we're kind of providing an overview of this program, you see quite a strong connection to the UBCM Complete Communities program that the village recently applied for. So the analysis that would be taking place in that Complete Communities program would really support these housing initiatives that we're proposing for the village. And because this is an incentive-based program, CMHC is very encouraging of and happy to see communities apply for similar type projects under the Complete Communities Fund, because again, it's like incentive based funding, so you're not kind of double dipping, if you will. And certainly municipalities that have complete communities in mind for these initiatives are looked on favorably by CMHC evaluators as well. I think some of the clear messages that we've really got from CMHC meeting with them over the last several months is because municipalities are essentially evaluated much higher if they can be bringing on new units early in the program. So the sooner that you can bring these initiatives to fruition, the higher evaluation scores you're going to get. And they certainly will fund, consultants, term staff to help make these things happen, because they recognize municipalities have limited resources, and that's why some of these things just aren't happening. So you can utilize the funds for that. But they also see municipalities that have, like the Village, the development approvals process improvements like well underway, that's a positive thing. If these initiatives are aligned with your strategic plan, it's another positive. Like, this isn't a major shift for you. This is really undertaking things maybe faster than you anticipated on, but you're getting funding to do it at a faster pace over this 3-year period. So when looking at your strategic plan, this really fits in with sort of your broad goal of constructing attainable housing, as well as, looking at these housing type initiatives through your OCP review, and a willingness to align your zoning bylaw to the future land uses in your OCP. So the way the funding works is, it's, as I've mentioned several times, it's incentive-based funding over and above the status quo. So we're to show you some sort of building permit statistics associated with the Village. And basically, if you kind of we have an average, a 5 and a 10-year average. We're recommending that utilizing the 10-year average for a number of reasons for Cumberland, but if you just keep doing what you've done on average over 10 years, you're not getting incented for that. It's the growth over and above the status quo. And so essentially the base funding would be anything above the the status quo. If you were just to put in a single family or single residential type unit, that would be $20,000 of incented funds. If that single family now has a suite, because of the way the funding works, it's got top-up funding. They'd both be considered missing middle housing. So that would equate to $32,000 for the single detached unit and $32,000 for the suite because of top-up funding. So $64,000 in total. So you could see they're incenting units that are with suites or with ADUs or missing middle type housing, which they essentially define as ground orientated housing and apartments up to 4 stories. Then there's another amount if it's an apartment greater than 4 stories, which would be the base funding of $20,000 plus $7,000 in incentive funding. So $27,000 for each apartment unit. And then there's a further affordable housing top up, which is essentially, non-market type housing. And that's sort of based on a little bit more of a complicated method on the sort of proportion of affordable housing units in your community. And that can provide an additional incentive top up. So when we look at the status quo for Cumberland, and BC Stats and Census Canada have building permit stats for each community, so we're electing to use those. They're probably more consistent because they have the same methodology across the country. So we've kind of shown here a 10-year average and a 5-year average. It's to the municipality's advantage for us to use the 10-year average. We've talked to CMHC about this because with the development being quite cyclical as it is, the last 5 years tend to have been bigger years in general in British Columbia. So, as we're kind of heading into a potential downturn, we want the status quo number to be generally lower. So we'd like to move forward with the 10-year average, which is a 48 units built annually in Cumberland over the last 10 years. And then there's a breakdown, based on the type, but that sort of key number of 48 kind of comes up again through the presentation. I'm going to revisit this slide at the end as well. But what we've done is we've done some projections to because I mean, I think the first question is how much is the grant application for? We've also provided a number, even just, a couple weeks ago when the report was drafted, that's lower than what you're seeing on the screen. There's some reason for that. One of the big changes is when CMHC advised that a legalized suite now counts as a missing middle unit at 32,000, but also that if we have an existing suite in the community that is not legalized, and that a building permit is issued to legalize that suite, it counts as a new unit. So as we go through the initiatives, we really see in a town, especially the size of Cumberland, a program to incent illegal suites to become legal, because we know there's quite a few of them in the community. And you can do things like through this program, like using a portion of those incentive funds as, like, for example, a forgivable loan to get people to come forward and to help them pay the cost of legalization. So we really, and those types of incentive programs can be used. So when you're counting the fact that existing illegal suites count as new units, the number of new units it's a little bit different, because we're kind of projecting about half the units being illegal units that become legalized. So it's a little bit less scary when you look at the numbers that we're projecting over and above the existing status quo. But so we looked at, if you stay on that 48 unit a year target, there's, no incentive funding, no half funding. If you just look at the meeting housing needs based on the last housing needs assessment that was completed, that would be putting you on track at 71 units a year. And that would equate to roughly $3.5 million in grant funding or funding application. If we pushed upwards on that and really pushed on this legalization program of existing ADUs, as well as encouraging ADUs to get built in new single family construction as it moved forward, we feel that the village could probably quite comfortably push upwards to 109 units a year. So that would include the existing suites that become legalized to $6.1 million in funding. And we'll revisit this once we go through the programs, because it looks like quite a lot, but when you break it down based on each initiative that we're proposing, we feel that it's doable. And if you look backwards at it just so happens to be this way, but when you look backwards at your status quo, in 2018, 109 units did come on stream that year. So it's something that you have done before. And these are the type of things that CMHC are looking at. Is this possible? I mean, if we came out with 200 units and your max year was 109, they'd probably go, that's probably a little far-fetched. But when they see that you've actually put that number out in the past, that's the type of initiative that they're looking for. And they did recommend being realistic yet ambitious, and to push on the side of ambitious on your application. So we've been working with staff for the last month or so on what these initiatives could be, and we've run them by CMHC. And so as we've developed these initiatives, we've looked at things that have been on your horizon, things you've been thinking about doing. Because if you've been thinking about doing them or planning, them, if you had the resources or you had funding, the likelihood of moving them forward faster is much higher. So one of those things is establishing the Affordable Housing Reserve Fund, which I believe is underway. But what you can also do is use the Housing Accelerator Fund as seed funding for that program as an expenditure. So you could essentially take $500,000 of the Housing Accelerator Fund and put it into Cumberland's Reserve Fund, and then utilize that fund to either incent the ADUs, as we mentioned earlier, or potentially buy up some land or support an affordable housing project, say a non-market housing project, that many communities might have conversations going on with a housing provider and BC Housing, but BC Housing would like it if the municipality would say do a DCC reduction, for example. But if you do a DCC reduction, the municipality is actually on the hook for that reduction. So you could utilize the seed money in the Housing Reserve Fund to pay for those things. So then that non-market housing moves forward, which it wouldn't have done without half funding. And therefore, that's sort of beyond your status quo and how it all works. When we've been putting together the 5 initiatives for the village, we've tried to move things forward as quickly as possible in sort of year 1 and year 2. And that is because the funding program really rewards municipalities that are getting things done early in the program. So anything you can do to incent ADUs, if you could set that program up, for example, in year 1, then you're going to start seeing those units coming on stream in year 2 and year 3. Whereas if you pushed it till year 3, you're not going to see those units come to fruition. So the first initiative is setting up this Housing Reserve Fund, but also setting up a sustainable fund that will go on into the future beyond the terms of the incentive funding. We also have updating development policy and regulations to support affordable housing development. So this would include the village has looked at community amenity contribution policy, but to expand that and to anticipate that the province may change the DCC legislation to create a community amenity development cost charge. We're anticipating to see some change sometime this fall or winter. And if that does come to fruition, it would make the village ready to potentially implement that. And then with an amenity development cost charge in place, the village might be more comfortable looking at pre-zoning sites rather than negotiating amenities through zoning amendments. So these are the types of things that the systemic change that they're looking for, as well as like updating the heritage alteration permit guidelines and helping interested developers sort of navigate those so that their application processing times don't take as long, or maybe some of that certainty is added to the application process for them. The third is something that council is very familiar with, especially when they see me before you, is the development application process improvement or modernization project. So the other thing that's nice about this Housing Accelerator Fund is the federal government announced it back in April 2022. So any of the initiatives that have been taking place, knowing that this Housing Accelerator Fund was coming online, can also work towards your program. So basically, some of the work that we've been doing the last year, we've considered in the fact that how it could also improve processing and the timelines associated with those, and factored them into the application, with phase 3 being the software improvements, e-permitting, staff training, which is really a 2023 and into 2024 program. So that's sort of another initiative, but something that's also underway, so the municipality is kind of well positioned in this one. The fourth initiative is the missing middle zoning bylaw update to align with the community's housing priorities. So when you're looking at even the existing official community plan, because I know the village has this initiative underway, but there's areas in the official community plan that have been identified for more density. For example, if you were looking to align your zoning bylaw with the existing OCP, let alone the one that's underway, and getting those sites identified and zoned in advance, it will speed up the process and in turn sort of incent development. So that is your fourth initiative. And the fifth and final initiative is encouraging and incentivizing ADUs, which the municipality has experience with in the past in terms of amnesty periods and waiving fees. And we are also proposing that you consider using your Housing Reserve Fund to incent these units, because this is something where you have some nice gentle density fitting in to the program. or into the village, and it's something that's very comfortable. But how can you promote that in the village to see more units come into fruition? And I should mention, just backing up to the fourth one, which I sort of neglected to mention, is as council's aware, the provincial government does have plans to potentially change legislation to allow plex development on single family lots throughout the province. This legislation and regulation is yet to be released, so we're not exactly sure how that's going to apply to the village, but it's always good to be ready for that as a municipality and to create zoning for where you want to see this type of plex type development. And so some of this may be around the downtown core. You've also got a situation in your community where you have a lot of older housing stock that might be close to fully depreciated, that could be developed into sort of plexes or more gentle density, at least with, suites or duplexes with suites and those types of things. So kind of undertaking that work and analysis as a municipality and looking at zoning to allow those types of uses as well is incorporated in that initiative. So then just to recap, based on these 5 initiatives that have been identified, sort of based on where the village is at and the ease of implementation quickly, these are the ones that we're recommending. Certainly looking forward to council's comments, or if you'd like additional information on sort of what those look like. And then, yes, we've kind of got a range here of a potential funding application, and which is due. The deadline is August 18th. So this is one of the very unique things about this program, is it came at us very quickly. It's quite a detailed application with a lot of sort of analysis. It's detailed yet high level, and CMHC sort of wants these initiatives to be, somewhat big picture, but you also have to think, what does that really mean? What does it take to implement it? What's it going to cost? What's the impact on units? What are the projections associated with it? So they're expecting quite limited information coming across them, but there's a lot of thinking and analysis you need to do to support the application. So we're here today really to get council's feedback. All action plans must be endorsed by council. The approval is recommended before application, because the things that we're talking about are, some of them include, pre-zoning. These are all council decisions, housing reserve funds. So we want to make sure that council is comfortable with what the application is proposed to be. And then we've got if the village is successful, you also need council endorsement prior to the contribution agreement being signed. So you could potentially put off, according to the grant, council's endorsement until the grant's actually being approved. However, we just feel that it's recommended to get council's input before submission, of course, because of the nature of the initiatives being proposed. And all of this needs to come together before August 18th. So quite a detailed process to pull together very quickly. And that concludes my presentation, and just would like to hand it over to council with any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you very much, Nancy. Council?
I had one question, because a lot of it's very attractive to look at removing the DCCs for low for low income housing, and for using this to cover maybe some infrastructure as well as the modernization. Does that have to be tied into a specific project, or a specific, we say, okay, we're doing this section of sewer, or we're modernizing this for this particular development? Are those two, do they have to be intimately linked, or can you just show that this will improve the process?
Through the chair. So yeah, not at all. It's been interesting, because it was some of the feedback we've received from CMHC regarding infrastructure is to not include it as a specific initiative, because we had infrastructure planning as a thought, because that's a very important one. And the advice we've received very recently from CMHC is not to do that. They're not scoring very well. The big cities got to apply earlier on June 14th, so they're going through the evaluation process now, and they've recommended sort of incorporating any infrastructure planning into other initiatives, so which we've done in your application draft, and then any expenditures. So if you have a project that maybe you need a pipe size increase or whatever, that would just be considered an expenditure. And all they're really expecting is, we anticipate spending 50% of the grant on infrastructure. And I think that they just want a sense of it. And if that changes a little bit, that would come out within sort of the monitoring and reporting over the course of the grant. And this is where CMHC would say, this is an incentive program. We want to see the supply. We want you to spend the units or the funding in an area that we support to support affordable housing, essentially. But we're not going to dictate exactly how you spend it.
Okay, thank you very much. That's quite encouraging.
I think we'll go to Mayor Brown.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So I'm just not quite understanding how the money flows. So is there an initial, based on the application, if it's approved, is there initial bit of money that comes to us, or are we required to approve DPs or subdivisions or whatever in order to get that money coming in? And then secondly to that is the funding coming, if that's the way it's coming, at approval stage or at build stage? And then I have some follow-up probably.
Through the chair. So the funding works, there's 4 payments. So 25% upon successful application, and then 25% each year after that, through this sort of 3-year period. There is monitoring and reporting required annually. So it could be possible for CMHC to potentially withhold some funds if the units were not forthcoming. That would likely be in year 3. And we've had many conversations about this with CMHC because as much as we'd like to, we can't control the markets. And, there's a lot of dialogue right now about potential recession and things like that. And it's like, we could do all the zoning and have all this in place and the building permit never gets issued. And I mean, they're certainly aware of that. They're certainly not sending a message like, oh, don't worry about it. But it's like a little bit more like, we'll cross the bridge, when you come to it. And potentially in year 3, I would expect if the unit count was lower than we hope, they might hold back some of those funds until later. I think a lot of it's really going to depend on market conditions and that the village has undertaken all the initiatives you said you would. But then, it is intended to be 25% each year, and it's based on building permit issuance.
Do you have a follow-up, Mayor Brown? Okay, we seem to have maybe lost Mayor Brown. We'll go with Councillor Kettler.
Thanks. So I was wondering, we talked about like growth targets. I guess I'm kind of concerned about setting a growth target. I think that we've done pretty well. As you know, we've been working on the modernization of our development approval, and we have already put in the ability for secondary suites in almost all of our residential zones. We have the ability to put in ADUs or carriage homes in all our central residential areas and the larger lots. So I think we've done a lot of the things that this is asking for, and I guess my concern is that if they want more than status quo, more than we've been doing, and we've had a pretty healthy growth rate, I think, that would that mean that we're like the pre-zoning is also a worry for me. Are we talking about pre-zoning of Greenfield? Because we've already done some of those other zones that they're requiring. And yeah, my concern is around, I guess, setting too high of a growth rate when we've already sort of put in place the things that we're comfortable with, the areas that we're comfortable with growing.
Through the chair, I mean, and that I think really reflects why we wanted to use the 10-year average versus the 5, which was the higher rate, knowing that Cumberland's done a lot and there's been a lot of development in the last 5 years. So kind of taking that into consideration and going like, here's the status quo. But, the intention of this, you don't see in the initiatives like a expectation to go to the greenfield sites, or at least one. I think there's one area that is sort of being identified for future development, but it might be like if it's been identified for single detached development, do you want to look at it maybe for plex development, or is there, or even duplex development, for example, or duplexes with suites, and like do that consideration would be sort of one of the initiatives, that missing middle type initiative. But it's again like under the auspices of sort of complete communities, infill type housing and gentle density is kind of being the initiatives and the way we've sort of aligned the village, and knowing that the growth that you have seen is a concern. And that's where I think the gentle density and the suites is where we see the most units coming forward. I think the other one, I know the village would very much love to see non-market housing move forward. And I know that there's been one development in particular that's had a hard time getting off the ground. And it's like there's some units right there that if there is a way through the sort of an incentive program or the Housing Reserve Fund that you could move that forward, that would be a key chunk of units. And I think the other sort of overarching thinking as well from our discussions with staff, and the CMHC is very specific that you don't make this about a specific address, but at the same time understanding that in smaller communities there's only so many addresses, and but you want to set up a policy that if you have a particular site in mind, but that the policy would be systemic and you could utilize it into the future. So some of the policy that we're talking about sort of attaching to that Housing Reserve Fund would also help the village guide civic lands that could be potentially redeveloped in the future to support affordable housing. And so I'm not sure that those developments might not come to fruition within the 3-year time, but it's like, how can you set the village up to have sort of clear policy and a reserve fund maybe to guide those projects?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for helping to clarify. And I guess does staff know, can this apply to the Second Street Affordable Housing Project still?
Yeah, well, I think probably. It depends, I think, on the timing of that project. But what comes to mind is that if we're successful, we can inject some funds into a housing reserve fund, and then the timing is such that perhaps then it could be a DCC waiver through that reserve fund. Then I think Nancy and I haven't talked about this specifically recently, but then some of those units could be eligible.
Great.
I see nods.
Okay, we'll go to Mayor Brown.
Thanks. Sorry, I lost you there briefly. So a similar follow-up. So there's the Cumberland Hotel site and the Victory site that have both been approved but haven't built out. So would those count? And on that same vein, the next potential phases of Coal Valley Estates, like stuff that's already in stream.
Through the chair, I mean, that's the third test, is where we're looking at what's in stream and what's possible. And I don't think that we would have put forward the pushing upwards sort of target if we didn't know, like if we didn't see what was in stream. And they all count towards it. It's just that when you're making your application, and I mean, we've got a lot of advice from CMHC on how to do that, but we really want to make it sound like there's barriers to moving some of those forward. And with the HAF funds, we can help alleviate those barriers to have this plan development happen within this 3-year term. And there's a lot of times that this plan development might take 5 or 6 years because you need to overcome those barriers because there's maybe an infrastructure associated with it, or staffing, to even push the applications forward and the approvals. So this is sort of how we set up the semantics of the application, if you will. But what we're trying to do is also look at it, and this is where the sort of challenge in this application is we know Cumberland's growing. We know there's going to be some building permits, but what do we need to do to maybe see a little bit more than we normally see to sort of address the housing crisis moving forward?
Okay, and so we could potentially change a bylaw, for instance, to increase or to ask for affordable housing in those applications that may come forward, using part of the fund to incentivize that with developers who are already in stream. So say we want Coal Valley Estate to do plexes instead of single family, we could use this to do that. Okay.
Through the chair, exactly. And that's where if someone was going to build a single family home, but you're like, we want suite readiness, or we want suites, or we'll give a forgivable loan of $5,000 to put in a suite. Therefore, you expect that those houses are going to come forward with suites. That's the type of innovation that CMHC is looking for.
Awesome. And so then could we also use it for, say, bylaw enforcement to move short-term rentals to long-term rentals, and through our new vacation or our short-term rental regulation that we've brought in, and then those would count as well, because we're realizing.
Through the chair, yes. I mean, part of the application when we talk about ADUs is also about potentially regulating short-term rentals or tightening up the policy, and those are all positive things. But they're seen as positive by CMHC, but are they creating a unit in the long term? And like that's where it's a little bit fuzzy, but they would weigh that out as being supportive of affordable housing. And the key for CMHC is units, like residential units. So it's a kind of an interesting grant, and it's a little bit fuzzy, but it's really about what can you do to see more than you normally put building permits out for.
Okay. I can't see if anyone's waiting to talk, so I don't know whether I can keep going.
We have Councillor Tyrion. Yep.
Yeah.
We'll go to him next. Thanks.
My question is that 78 or 109 total? Is that over and above the 48 status quo, or is the 48 included in that number?
Through the chair, the 48 is included in that number. So instead of doing 48 a year, it would be 109 per year.
Okay, and then the follow-up is, do we have to, when we make this application, do we have to state what kind of a target we are shooting for? We've got to decide whether we want to go for the 78 and an additional, 23 units, or the 109, which would be an additional, 50, almost 60 units, I guess.
Through the chair, yes, you have to set your target. You have to basically, each initiative, you would project how many units that's going to bring on stream beyond the status quo. And that's how CMHC determines the funding. The advice that we have from CMHC when they look at these is it's not, one and done, is that if they could potentially come back and say, we feel you're being a little ambitious, we'd like you to reduce your target by a little bit, or you know what I mean, if they think that's the case, or tell me how you're going to achieve this in a little more detail. But yes, we have to set those targets, and the higher the target, also the more higher you score, the evaluation is higher.
Do you have something else, Mayor Brown?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, is that, or do we have a better chance with the 109 or with the lower amount? And I think I just heard that answer. I'm concerned, given the conversation we're going to have at our next meeting around water and water usage. And so, do we have the water to do that kind of growth? Probably over the next 4 years, maybe. But I would want to find a way to update our water supply plan to ensure that that's the case before we did that. And I don't suppose that planning work would be covered under this program as well.
Through the chair, in terms of funding the infrastructure planning, to support growth, that could be a viable use of the expenditure funds. So in terms of if you're doing planning and constructing infrastructure to meet these growth needs, that's an absolute use of the expenditure funds. Yeah.
Great. Can they help us with our wastewater costs as well? That's a little bit facetious, but if it could, we would definitely be looking for that as well.
Okay, Councillor Tyrion.
Just one more question about those numbers. Are those a per year number? Is that like expecting to build 109 units per year for the next 3 years, if we shoot for that target?
That's correct. To hit that pushing upwards. When we look at this moving forward, it's probably unlikely, as we kind of get into the details of the application, that you're going to be able to put that amount of units out in year one, because it's sort of discounted because you don't necessarily have the initiatives in place. So we'll have to likely refine that a little bit. But I would say in year 2 and year 3, that would be the target.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions from council? Mayor Brown?
I just had one more. So it's a 4-year program, as I understand, and so we would commit to doing this 4 years, and then we could stop. Yes.
Through the chair, in the information they provided, they've often referred to it as a 4-year program, but really it's 3 years from when they give the funds out in December 2023. It's expected to, or November, December 2023. It's expected to end in 2026. So you would get that first chunk of funding upon successful application or award, and then 25% for the next 3 years. But in terms of answering your question, yeah, this is intended to sort of increase the supply of housing over the 3-year period. And then after that, the funding would no longer be there, and nor would the monitoring.
But all the programs would. Yeah.
So is this going to come back to us so we can apply with sort of this high level plan, and then it seems like it will get more detailed as it goes along? So will we have the opportunity as council to have input as it's moving along and getting more into those details?
Through the chair, it would be quite challenging to, it'd be great to get council's feedback to see if there's general support for these 5 initiatives. In terms of sort of going through the detailed application with council based on this time frame of August 18th being the deadline, and there's a lot of information to enter into this very detailed portal. So we're going to want to be doing that sort of well in advance of the deadline. But in terms of you looking at the proposed initiative, I think pretty much all of them are council decisions. So I think you'll see each of these initiatives over the course of the next 3 years in detail, with a lot of opportunity to deliberate. So I think, we've tried to align them so they meet your strategic priorities and your OCP and sort of your goals and objectives. And I think if you feel that they're not, now would be a good time to be providing that insight.
Okay, yeah, it's good to hear that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm gently optimistic about this. I think the growth is necessary, but everybody's scared about it too. But I support this moving forward. So you have a recommendation, Council?
Do you need a number at this point in time as well? Of how many units we should be shooting for, or?
Through the chair, in terms of how it's worded, in terms of those support for those initiatives, I think is satisfactory at this time. If council has a concern, with the pushing upwards, for example, I think that should be stated. But if council's supportive of, that sort of upper range, it would be good to have that feedback.
I think if it's directed properly, like we've talked about, more infill, moving from single family to the plexes, those kind of initiatives I think are well supported, and I think could go a long way to meeting that goal. I'd like to see a little bit more of the affordable housing side brought in there, but I think again those details will come back to us. So yeah, I'm happy to support as recommended today.
Mayor Brown?
I just I did have a look at the application and noticed that they're in the list of incentives that that's been provided by Nancy. There's, I think, included in that, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but we could also do disincentives or costing or fee structures to discourage vacancy on underdeveloped or idle lands and low density housing, and other, including mixed use redevelopment of village owned properties. So that to me is stuff we already have planned, but isn't necessarily in our count yet. So I'm comfortable with the higher count because we have these, like the rebuild of the municipal, our municipal projects and all of these other things sort of already in stream that I think will make up a lot of those numbers already. And I think we can fit these other incentives and bylaws into the existing application that's been created. So I support it as well.
Council?
Okay, should I go ahead?
Yep.
I'd like to move that the committee recommend that council direct staff to submit a Housing Accelerator Fund action plan that includes the initiatives as generally outlined in the staff report dated July 14th, 2023, along with all additional required documentation to the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation as the village's application under the Housing Accelerator Fund program, and that the committee recommend that council authorize the chief administrative officer to enter into any contribution agreements or amending agreements that may be required should the village be approved for the funding under the program.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? So moved. Oh, we saw you there, Mayor Brown. Next we have strategic, thank you very much, Nancy. Thank you, Courtney.
Thanks, Nancy.
Next we have strategic priorities, second quarter report, April to June 2023, prepared by Michelle Mason, our CAO. Michelle.
Okay, so this is your first, it's the second quarter reporting, but it's your first reporting under your new strategic priorities 2023 to 2027. The actual report that we give you that outlines our progress towards your priorities doesn't have any comments in it yet, but those will be worked on over the next 3 months until your next quarterly report, and they'll be entered into that report. And then the other thing to note is that the dates are based on, you know, things that we discussed during the strategic priority sessions and that, but those are still in draft, and they will be finalized in your next quarterly report as well, and that's what we'll be moving forward with. But just to highlight a couple of things, we had a very successful Plan Your Community Street event for the Transportation Master Plan and the OCP update in May. Then we also had the OCP bylaw amendments for the Quaxida affordable housing project as well. And then we also were able to witness the raising of the 2 welcome poles on National Indigenous Peoples Day, which was also happened, and that went very successfully. Then the wastewater treatment capital upgrades, the construction is now started, so that's pretty big news too. So the attached to this report is all of your strategic priorities and actions that staff are proposing to meet those priorities, and then also some of your department reports like the financial statements and some protective service items, your development stats, and then your action list in how we're progressing towards that. One thing I will say is both the CFO and the Manager of Protective Services isn't here, so I'll do my best to answer any questions you have without them here, and then we may have to get back to you on some of those.
Thank you very much. Questions of council? Going once, going twice. Oh, Mayor Brown.
I'll go first. Thank you. It's great to see our new strategic priorities all listed up here. I have, so on page 17 of 57, right? Yep. Under sustainable service delivery and asset management, we talked about inventorying village assets, including natural assets. But I'm also hoping that in that, while we are doing that, we're identifying potential green infrastructure to replace existing gray infrastructure as it fails. So as part of the asset management plan, and then also developing green infrastructure substitutes for gray infrastructure in our development permits. And I'm not sure that that's been incorporated into the work plan. So I just wanted to flag that and see whether that's part of it in some way, or how we might get there, I guess.
Yeah, through the chair, that's good of you to note that. The objective does talk about green infrastructure, so yeah, we'll take that back to the staff level and see if that will meet what you're talking about, or if we need to change the language a little bit.
Awesome, thank you.
Any other questions?
I can ask another one if nobody else is ready yet.
No, you're on a roll. Go for it.
Okay. Under the multimodal transportation management, there's the complete the master transportation plan that we're all very excited about. And I'm just wondering about future, further engagement on that. Is that moving along simultaneously with the OCP, or do I keep needing to nudge it back in there so that we're collecting all of that as much as we're doing outreach or gathering input, I suppose?
We've got Rob coming up.
Thanks, Rob.
I think the initial kickoff to engagement was a joint effort, but moving forward it will be separate. So OCP, they'll have their own separate engagement. There is round 2 of the Transportation Master Plan engagement slated for kind of end of summer and into the fall. I think September. There's another big round of engagement. So, but yeah, they will be separate.
Okay. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you. Anyone else? Councillor Tiernan?
I just wanted to talk a little bit about our bylaw enforcements. I'm noticing that almost everything that we're doing is animal control. And there's one, can you tell me about the one vacation rental bylaw infraction that what happened there? Was that a report? Has that moved to,
Yeah.
is that a unit that's come off of Airbnb and is now a vacation rent, or is now a long-term rental unit, or what happened with that piece of enforcement, and can we get more of that?
Through the chair, yes, I do agree we need more of that. So we are actually working on an enforcement policy to steer us, where we will also need to probably analyze resource capacity for the vacation rentals. But I will have to, maybe? No, I will have to let you know what that file was about,
Okay.
and I'll update you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question about the financial. Is that the time to ask it now?
Sure.
About
Or-
Annie's report?
Yep. I
Um,
can answer.
So on the spending commitments between 50,000 and 200,000, just the building inspection, I'm just wondering, just curious how, it just says the commitment date is April 14th and the 69,000, just wondering what period that covers for building inspection. Do you know?
I believe that would be one year. Or? I'm thinking 1 year.
For a full
yeah.
year? Okay,
Yeah.
great, thanks.
That's it for everyone. Okay, we've got question period. Please send your questions by email to info@cumberland.ca using subject.
Should I
sorry.
move to the committee receive the strategic priorities first quarter report, April to June 2023?
Yes, please. Seconded. All in favor? All right.
Back to you.
Thank you. Now we have question period. Do we have any questions? None in the gallery. Do we have any online?
Oh, yeah, I do.
We do have a question. How can we look, this is regarding the Housing Accelerator Fund. How can we look at accelerating housing when not enough water right now as stage 3 is being contemplated?
Suppose we could look into perhaps using this funding to explore the Hamilton Lake option at some, or not Hamilton Lake, but the Van West Lakes there option in the future. Might be worth.
I can speak to that if you want.
Mayor Brown.
So I think that's why I mentioned the updating the water supply plan, so that it's climate accurate, given the current drought and potentially, extreme rain coming later. I think that there's room to add those units without them being actually all physical units, and to add that usage with better conservation methods. And
That's fair. Anyone else?
Just, Michelle, how long is the Royston agreement still for? And how many units of housing units is that?
So through the chair, Royston uses, I don't know how many housing units, they use between 28 and 30% of our water supply. And their agreement ends at the end of this year with the option to extend for 2 more years. And my understanding is that they likely will request for an extension. But so yes, we will have that water back in that time.
Excellent.
I just actually had a question for Rob there. Sorry, regarding this, and like every system has leakage from old infrastructure. What's your estimate on our leakage as far as as we improve it going into the future? How much do you think we're going to improve upon the delivery?
So we don't actually have a percentage on the leakage because there's what we call unaccounted for water. So
Yeah.
the fire department uses water, contractors use water, leaks. There's leaks and there's other means, like even up at the water treatment plant, we use processed water for all the instrumentation and everything that we have now that just kind of goes down the drain, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, typically 10 to 20% is good. We're above 20% for unaccounted for water right now. But
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions, Rachel?
Just on that last point, though, I think when we did put in water meters, we did catch a lot of those leaks, Rob, is that correct? And so,
Yeah, for being proactive in the valley here and having, you know, a water regulation bylaw or a conservation bylaw since 2005, and then the water meter program, we saw quite a reduction in our max day demand. So we cut it almost in half in the summer water use, which is pretty impressive. So yeah, the meters made a big difference.
thanks.
Thanks. Okay, no more questions. We'll go for adjournment.
Move adjourn. Oh wait, no, we got to make a
I think so.
yeah,
Yeah.
move adjournment.
Second?
Yep.
Is yup second? Councillor Kettler on the yup. All in favor?
Yep.